Today I wanted to talk about obedience and kind of just get as wholesome as I possibly can with this topic. I think one of the first things that I think of is blind obedience and having that conversation with some people. It's not good to blindly obey anything in especially a faith or God or whatever the case is. But a huge part of obedience is not having the whole picture, right? When we obey parents, for example, as we're growing up, we don't have the full picture. They do, seemingly, right? So when they say something like, don't put your hand on the oven or, the stovetop or whatever the case is, it's because they know that that's going to hurt us. And we don't know that quite yet, maybe. And so we have to decide, am I going to trust this person or not? And that kind of brings up the point of obedience. In obedience, you don't need to necessarily understand 100% why or what you are supposed to do in obedience and like why. You don't need to understand all the whys. Ultimately, I guess maybe I'm saving hours of thinking. Ultimately, you need to believe or understand who is giving the direction, right? And so we obey out of love and faith. We obey. Obedience is a gift, right? It's an offering that we do to people we respect, right? It's an offering that we do to people that we respect because we respect their opinion. We respect how they think in their mind. We also believe that that person has the best intentions for us and that they love us. And that faith, that is where it stems from. So we don't need to understand the act that they're telling us to do. We just need to understand the person who's giving the command. I think that's huge when we understand obedience to parents, obedience to people, maybe our higher ups, managers, whatever the case is. And especially it goes to God, right? If God has, like, you look at a lot of the stories in the Old Testament and in the New, but, I'm thinking of Abraham, Moses, these people that have been called out of their comfort zone into a world, into the unknown, right? Especially Abraham being the first to go on that journey, right? He's dubbed the father of faith because there was no precursor, right? Like when I look at, for example, my parents' faith or the faith of others or the testimonies of others, and they give me a synopsis, like a summary of who God is and their experience. And so I can, if I trust them and trust their judgment, then they can give me kind of an idea of who God is. And so there's less ambiguity to it. But Abraham, no one else knew of this invisible God, or at least that he's encountered. That's kind of the point. So when we obey God, what we're really doing is trusting in his character and trusting in his promises and trusting that he loves us and all of these things. And so whatever he asks of us, we're willing to do for this. My dad and some pastors will also bring up, well, there's also a fear component, right? Love can take you so far. Faith can take you so far. But sometimes it's just like the fear of bad consequences, right? And I don't mean punishment. I hope you don't believe that God punishes us. It's not absurd. I understand where it comes from, but Jesus took it all on the cross, and that's been paid for. But what I mean is purity, for example. The lack of purity comes with heartbreak, a lot of emotional problems, and so forth. So there are natural consequences to disobeying God. And so there could be a fear in that way. There could also just be a fear of hurting God, which I don't know if I've talked about it yet. I'm wrestling with that just theologically. I think that, yeah, okay, maybe for another episode. But when it comes to obedience to God, I've also had the conversation with people of like, God doesn't speak to me specifically, I feel like. It's usually people younger in their faith, new to their faith. And the first thing I get at is that there's kind of two levels to obedience. There is the macro and then the micro level of obedience. And what I mean by that is something like God won't speak to you specifically if you don't listen to him generally. And what I mean by that is if the Bible is our first step, is if walking by faith is the first step, the Great Commission is the first step, right? If preaching the gospel, like these things are in the Bible, it's written in the Bible, and it's general for every Christian who believes in the Word of God, that these are the things that we ought to do. So God's not going to get specific with you unless you do the general thing. And as you do the general thing, you find your niches and you find like certain things, and God directs in that. And that's where he gets specific, is when you're trying to figure out your niche, when you're trying to figure out how am I the most effective, then God starts talking. And it's not like a tit for tat kind of deal. It's not like you have to be good enough or whatever the case is. I think it's just like opening your eyes. Like it's almost like, it's not that God is distant or anything, but you're not in the middle of his plans for him to then actually talk to you. It's like if God is in a war, he's only commanding the soldiers that are with him in this war, right? And I think it's something like that. And again, understanding that everyone has their own ministries. It all doesn't look like evangelism. It all doesn't look like pastoring. It doesn't look like leading small groups or whatever the case is. But as your mind starts being transformed and you start seeing the world as mission ground, as a place to display the glory of God, then God starts speaking to you. And people will ask, well, how do we know we're hearing from God? A pastor from San Marcos, he is now a missionary. He's all over the place. I don't know where he's at right now. But Pastor Peter, if you're listening, thank you for this. This is it simplified it almost too much, but it's so true. And essentially, he's told me the devil is never going to tell you to pray for someone or to sit down with somebody and hear them out and all these things. So good things are God things. Like in that sense of helping your community, helping your friends, helping your neighborhood. These are God things. There's no evil there. And one thing I have learned is that even if there is a sense of ego, you do it long enough and it gets burnt out. The tests and the trials and through all of that, like the imagery that I have is like of gold, right? Being refined. That's what it looks like. I remember when I started pastoring to the youth group, the huge thing that came up was this ego of mine, this savior complex that I thought I was going to change Round Rock and the new generation that comes through Round Rock and this and that. Round Rock is a place, it's a suburb north of Austin. And slowly that started just going away, and through therapy, even like it wasn't through supernatural means necessarily. Although I think my call was, I could explain that further down. But we get refined and doors open and doors close, and God guides us through, sometimes not through audible or anything for sure. It's just by how your life ends up. And then you look in retrospect and you realize, oh, God's kind of been leading me in this direction this whole time. And I just couldn't see it. Or maybe that's just a lack of perspective. And maybe that's just a lack of how we're discipled, but like the lack of discipleship or in that area of understanding. It's not this like Jesus walking through the desert with the Holy Spirit. I think a better example is Paul walking around in Arabia for a couple of years, hearing from Jesus himself and this and that. It might not look like that all the time. I don't have a good example in the Bible, but I think for a lot of people, if you ask them in the most practical sense, they just want to glorify God, and they use the skills that they have, and wherever that leads them, it leads them. And then that's just really the case. But one thing I'd like to bring up, which is another pastor, a friend of mine, pastor over from the Springs, from San Marcos, he talks about the language of our hearts and how God speaks directly to the language of our hearts. For me specifically, I've had dreams that I thought were just dreams, and then I lived it out, and I was like, whoa, because I thought it was deja vu. It definitely wasn't deja vu, because I remember like waking up and talking to a friend about the dream, and then a month later, and it's silly stuff. Like I had a dream that I was playing soccer in the midfield, but in my dream I thought I was playing for Chelsea and this and that. But then in real life, I was just wearing a blue training jersey, and it was for this third division semi-pro team in Round Rock. And I just remember the same scene happening, and I was like, whoa, that's weird. That's crazy. So I've had stuff like that. I've had audible moments. One where I was crushing on this girl, and I was praying about her, and I was like, I don't know. And God said that this woman was going to show me how to love. That didn't work out, but she definitely made me sit down and think about what love was. And a whole album came out from that, from the thinking that I had to do. And the philosophizing, the thinking, the prayer, the reading, all of that. And so again, a lot of times, I'll get these snippets, and they're not what I think it is, right? Because obviously, when you hear, oh, this person's going to teach you how to love, you're thinking, oh, this is my next wife. That couldn't be further from the truth. But it did prepare me. Very much it prepared me. Sometimes it's a feeling that I just could not shake. There were times where I felt like I should do something. I didn't do it, and I got really depressed until I did it. This was sometimes quitting a job and going to a different job. Sometimes this was like having people in my life that I shouldn't have anymore. It wasn't like that it was horrible or toxic or anything. There was just like, I don't know, a lack of purpose or whatever the case is. But usually I feel like, well, not usually, but I think what people tend to talk about a lot is like, oh, I feel a sense of peace. The problem is, if you know anything about the Enneagram, and there's a lot of nines in the world, and nines care about inner peace. The problem is that an unhealthy nine will dissociate or just kind of like be kind of crazy in how they achieve that peace. They will completely ignore problems. They'll ignore situations in their lives to hold on to that feeling of peace. And so, and man, I'm bringing up my brother. I'm a PK. My brother's a PK, so I don't think he minds too much. And it's what I told him, I guess. But because he's a 9, so I told him, look, with what you're praying for and this and that, your decision, it's not going to be just a sense of peace. It's going to be the sense of, this is the right thing for me to do. This is going to have the challenges, and it's going to make me grow the way that God wants me to grow, or, whatever it is. It's not, when I say the right thing, I don't necessarily mean the moral thing. And I bring that up because when you talk about obedience to people that don't follow God, right, the question becomes, am I going to be right, or am I going to be loving? See, because when we think of holiness, right, when we think of holiness, we think of angels and God and perfection, right? The thing is about that is that we think that perfection and God and all these things are some kind of moral, like a moral trait. Being holy is to be morally good. And I'm going to be bold in saying this, but I really don't think so. I think it's being set apart in love and compassion. And so when we obey, or when we have people over us, it might not be fully aligned with God, right? There has to be that balance of am I going to be right, or am I going to show this person love and respect, like we were talking about at the beginning? Are we going to have faith in God that this might turn out to be a better outcome than if I just stood my ground? Or am I going to stand my ground, right? And I think the answer lies in how much true harm it will cause you, right? I was talking to my youth group about this. We kind of did like a small group, and I was asking these questions, and they kind of said like, yeah, I've heard of, my friends, their parents, that say like, well, I guess a common one is like when a dad, goes to his son and says, hey, when are you going to be a man, right? Like, when are you going to start sleeping around? When are you going to do this, and that? And, some kids, out of that peer pressure, that adult pressure in their life, they go down a route that's very destructive, and that does suck. And is that a moment to stand your ground? I mean, I think, especially I think the way that I put it, I think the answer is yes, obviously yes. But there's been cases with alcohol, right? With drugs. Your parents that are like, hey, I want to see you use some right now, or whatever the case is. And that can get dangerous, right? But sometimes I can't think of anything specific, because I am really bad with examples, but I can't think of anything that would pin you against these two things, being right and being loving. I think that I can't. But the point is, when we are trying to listen to God, the feeling of peace isn't enough for us to believe that God spoke to us and gave us the clue to go in this direction. Kind of going back to the macro about obedience, the Bible, like when we talk about purpose, a Christian's purpose, it's the general is very much laid out, right? It's the Great Commission: go out and make disciples and baptize them in the name of the Holy Spirit, Father and Son. Okay. And then in Ephesians 4, if I'm not mistaken, at the end, Paul says that our mission is to build up the church in maturity, right? And so that means that we need to become mature ourselves, and then we need to use our skills and talents to mature the church. No, that can look like podcasting, that can look like music, that can look like a lot of things, but you're edifying, right? And this is, again, that macro. Now the micro is, okay, you accept that, you're now walking in faith, you're now trying to do these things, and then God specifically will either talk to you, will give you, an idea, like, hey, go start a podcast, whatever the case is, or he'll put you in the room with someone who wants to start a podcast and push you in that direction, or whatever the case is. A lot of times, and I know this is like silly, but maybe for those that are more on the fence, right, about spirituality and this and that, I do believe that for most people, it becomes a retrospective thing that we look back and say, oh yes, God was definitely talking to me to do this thing. And I don't think that in the moment people are so confident to say that God told me to do this thing most of the time. My next point, if you believe that you're not hearing from God, okay, there's a few possibilities. One, maybe you're in the middle of a test, right? I've heard it from George Janko most recently. I don't know. I don't remember. I think I've heard it before, but George Janko says that um, God is is quiet during tests. You know, like a teacher, he's going to be quiet during a test. And so, and I do see that. I think about Abraham, and I think about how God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. And I believe the whole point of that test, of that challenge, was not to show God, not to show God that Abraham, has that faith, right? Because God is all knowing. He knows that Abraham has that faith. What I think happened instead was that Abraham needed to know how much faith he had in God. And he needed to see the character of God. And he needed to see how God can provide, even if he gave everything to God, right? Because Isaac was his promised child. Isaac was the hope of his future, his legacy. So, of course, Isaac was probably an idol in Abraham's life. And so for him to give that up was a tremendous act of faith. And again, it is going back to the fact that he doesn't have to trust in what he's doing. He doesn't have to trust in the task at hand. He doesn't have to understand it at all. It's not blind faith because his faith is not blind in God. It might be blind in the act that he's doing, right? Because a few times he said, "Oh, God will provide. God will provide." He said that in faith, but he didn't know for a fact, right? There was a lot of unknowns there, but what he did know is that God is a man of his word, is that God would not withhold any blessing from him. He believed in God, and he believed in the character of God. He believed in the love that God had for Abraham, and he was willing to do that. Again, in the middle of all the quiet. And if you're in the middle of a test, a lot of times God's testing you in his quietness for you to evolve and to be sharpened and to grow, because that's just how we function. Like we need stress to learn things. We need things to be real for us to remember things. If I knew without a doubt that, let's say that it's that scene where, like there's an invisible bridge and people are like, "Oh, what? No, there isn't." If I could see the bridge, I would walk through it, right? And I wouldn't need faith, and I wouldn't need to understand anything, and that wouldn't challenge me and involve me in any way. But if it's invisible, I have to take that leap. I have to trust, right? And that grows intimacy. And I talked about that before, about how being prayerful through life creates more intimacy when miracles happen and when God shows up. Another reason, and most recently, again, I hear this from Mike Todd, but I've heard other pastors say this, is that maybe God won't tell you the next thing because maybe you haven't completed the last thing. This is my experience. This is what I was going to bring up. Is I felt like a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, that God was telling me very clearly, and I say clearly because, let's see, when I would go to pray and spend time with God, my mind would always go back to that. And so, I would ask God to search my heart and show me the things I need to repent of. And I would, pray for things, pray for my wife, pray for, my ministry and all these things. And I would ask, like, God, is there anything that you would have me do? Is there, what do I do next with the ministry? And, all of these things. My mind would always go back to, hey, you need to let go of all of this art, all the music, all of the content, all of these things that you just kind of like put in your closet and storage and hoarded and all of these things, like these things need to go out. Not and since then, so this is a year and a half ago, I did not, I didn't do it for a long time. And it kept bugging me and it kept bugging me. But even in that, I think this is how merciful God is. Even in me not doing it, God has changed how I think about it, because what I was thinking was that I was going to start releasing stuff and then magic was going to happen, right? Because in my head, that's the only reason why God would have me release things. And slowly, God just gave me the grace to stop taking myself so seriously, understand that like if this is what preoccupies my mind, I can't go on to the next thing. And so I do just need to let it go. And this is how I let it go. I'm not going to delete it all because it's precious to me, it means something to me. And so all these podcasts, these thoughts, the music, the time I spend thinking and feelings through all of these things, I think is valuable. And if it helps one person, I've done enough with what I've done already. And so I can't move on until I get this all out. And this is what all of this is. That's why I've been releasing podcasts like crazy all of a sudden. And even if I can't sit in front of a camera and, have my mic, because all of this is on my phone. Like I'm just recording these on my lunch breaks and just quickly editing and sending it. I just need to get it out there. And that's kind of where my convictions are right now is like, I haven't released everything. And maybe 2 years and a half ago, God told me almost 3 years now, because I guess I started leading the youth group in January 2 years ago, but it was somewhere around August 3 years ago that God started putting it in my heart to serve. And I'll even tell that story, and maybe that'll help in some things. So I guess important context is that so people don't think I'm so emotional because I rationalize things. Well, the thing is because I rationalize my emotions and I express my emotions in words. So it's like my vocabulary, the diction that I use really expresses my emotions more than maybe feelings, right? I don't necessarily express too many feelings. I like crying. I'll be honest about that. I cry almost. It usually is anything Christ related, and yeah, I'm biased, I guess, but also it's seeing stuff on screen to me about the power of God is just captivating every time. Like it's weird. I was one of those people, and I kind of still am, but I've softened up a little bit about like, all these Christian cheesy movies and Christian cheesy like songs and this and that. I think just my obsession with God has kind of like trumped that, where like just seeing a good miracle movie, just hearing a good worship song, or like even hip hop music that really, really glorifies God, like Forrest Frank, Halsey, these up and coming guys, this is what I'm talking about. But, obviously the older guys I still listen to this day, but these people that just worship God and I see that and everything, like that just like does crazy stuff to my heart. Point is, I am an emotional person, but it is very much expressed in thoughts and words. What happened was 3 years ago, sorry. My mom is like, "Hey, your dad's thinking about stepping down from youth pastor. He's gonna, continue as associate pastor, but he's just, tired. He can't keep up with all these kids, and he just doesn't, there's no connect there. Like, he's getting old. He can't keep up with the lingo and this and that. I can't keep up with the lingo. Gen Z is insane. I'm a Gen Z. I'm the oldest, year. I'm 97. But these guys, just not even a vocabulary can I keep up. But regardless, we still have like the same mindsets and the same drives and all of these things. Um, but regardless, wow, I'm just going off the rails here. Um, when my mom told me this and she said, "Hey, pray about it," I laughed at her face. I really did. I was like, "Mom, I will never go through what y'all have gone through with parents, with kids, with all how upsetting and torturous it is to be a youth pastor. I will not go through that. I'm sorry. Like I value my peace." And then there was a woman that I then met with a couple of months later from the church. It was like the director, or she is the director of the kids ministry, and she was like, "Hey, look, like these kids need you. You know, like they well, they don't need you, but they need someone, and you're there. You're that person." And I was like, "You don't understand. I don't want to do this. I've seen my parents go through this for 15 years. I don't want to go through this at all." I started praying about it, and I told one of the members of the youth group to make a list for me and make a list of all the people in the youth group. And, I just started praying for them. And what happened was that God really put a love in my heart for these kids, like as if they were my kids. Started caring about them so much. More context, maybe like a lot of these kids are now 15, 16, right? So they were 13, 14. But when I left that church to go to college, they were all, I don't know, 7, 8 years old. And these were the kids that I didn't see grow up, but for some reason they were all little brothers, little sisters to me, and they were family, and I really, really cared about them. And all of that happened, and then they opened up a position. It's volunteer work, so I don't get paid for it, but and that's kind of how it happened. Like I I wasn't expecting, and maybe you listen to that story and you're like, yeah, of course. And maybe even it, touched my ego a little bit that, they're like, hey, we need you, or whatever the case is. But in my mind, I was absolutely against it. I didn't care, what they needed or whatever. I didn't want that responsibility. And there was a toll, like going through it in that obedience. I still, there was so much heartbreak. There were so many challenges. There was so much humbling, and there's so many insults and hurt. And that's why, like, I will now and forever, especially with pastors, always give the benefit of the doubt. With worship leaders, with whatever the case is, always the benefit of the doubt. And if there isn't enough information on the subject, then my answer is I don't know. In my opinion on them, and I do believe in the innocent until proven guilty. But my point in all of this is that what obedience looks like and what hearing from God looks like might not be this supernatural thing of the skies opening up and light shining down and hearing a thundering voice, but it might just be God placing you in the right place at the right time. I've heard people talk about how like success, like or quote unquote like blessing has guided their path. Some people are like, oh, I made a TikTok and it went viral, and so I just kind of started doing that and it worked. Them saying, oh, I felt like God told me to make a TikTok, and I did, and it went viral. And to me, that's insane. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, I think I'm a testimony to that obedience, because I don't, to the different kind of obedience, of the obedience of just sticking to things that I know God has told me. And until he tells me otherwise, I'm going to keep doing it regardless of the success. I think so. And again, going back, God speaks to the language of your heart. You know, I don't need that success to know that I'm being obedient. I just need to know that I need to feel like I'm doing the right thing. And um and it doesn't need to have success. I would love the success. The success would be nice. The success would pay my bills, but it doesn't. And even if it doesn't ever, I will stick to what I felt like God told me. But again, it's not a for sure thing. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe God doesn't want me to do this, but with the capacity He's given me, the testimony He's given me, and the love that He's given me for people, for disparaged groups, for people who don't understand and aren't understood. These are the people I want to reach. And so that's kind of where it goes from that. It's macro to micro. Like this is the niche I'm finding myself in because I truly care and I truly will fight for those people who are on the fence about Christianity. And that includes people of all communities. I think I'm starting to repeat myself a little too much, so I'm just going to go. But I hope that helps anyone. Again, sometimes it's a lot more logical than it is some kind of supernatural, spiritual, mystical experience. Mystical is a better word. I think people try to make everything mystical in Christianity. For me, it definitely has not been. And I still believe because I believe in the character of God, and I've seen His care, and I've seen Him provide for me when I didn't think there was an avenue for that. So, God bless.